So in this video we're going to look at the policies that the government might use to reduce the level of unemployment. In other words, what is the solution to unemployment? And really they come into two categories: supply side and demand side. Now you might do more on these when you do supply side policies or when you do demand side policies. But let's look at the demand side to start with. The demand side will not solve the causes of unemployment that are due to supply side policies, such as frictional real wage or structural unemployment. But they will deal, of course, with Keynesian unemployment or demand deficient, which is demand deficient unemployment. So first of all, we have monetary policy. A monetary policy would obviously involve a reduction in interest rates, okay, and that should lead to an increase in consumption and an increase in investment, okay, which will increase output from firms, which will create more demand for labour. The problem is, of course, what will happen necessarily to other components of aggregate demand, such as government expenditure. If that was reduced, then that would compensate and the policy wouldn't have its intended consequence. The other problem, of course, if interest rates are generally low, as they have been after 2008, if interest rates are very low, then it's not really going to have much effect reducing them further, say from 0.5% to 0.25%. So you might need quantitative easing, which is a more unpredictable policy, of course, and has effects such as making the wealthy more wealthy. But see the video on quantitative easing for that. And the other problem is, even if you reduce interest rates, if banks are reluctant to lend because they're being cautious, then that's not going to have much effect in terms of consumer spending through more credit or through investment with more borrowing from banks. And maybe see videos on banking for the way that banks behave. Okay, so that's monetary policy, and of course we have fiscal policy. So a reflationary fiscal policy would obviously be reducing tax rates and or increasing government expenditure. This should then lead to an increase in consumption. Say a decrease in tax rates could lead to an increase in consumption, could lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Firms will experience an increased demand for their goods and services. Because labour is a derived demand, there should be an increase in the demand for labour, unless firms increase their output by using more capital or maybe outsourcing from another country. And Keynes, of course, was a great fan of a reflationary fiscal policy and explained how that would work. However, it depends really on what's happening to the other components. Again, what's happening to investment, what's happening to exports and imports. It depends also what's happening to saving. If there's a tax cut, households might just increase saving. Another aspect is time lags. So it'll take a year or two for this to work its way through the economy. And another aspect, of course, is that government borrowing would increase. Is it possible for the government to increase borrowing? What's happening in bond markets? Are interest rates high there? And it will be difficult and expensive for the government to borrow. Alternatively, is it easy for the government to borrow, in which case it's not a problem. And some argue that crowding out may occur. Okay, it's where crowding out is because when the public sector becomes bigger and pushes out the private sector, and if the government was to seriously increase its reflationary fiscal policy, that might happen to some extent. Again, see the video on crowding out, okay, with a cupcake, worth watching. Okay, and then that's demand side. On the supply side, okay, this obviously will have less effect on Keynesian unemployment, although sometimes it does involve expenditure. So you might be able to solve, say you increase government expenditure on education and training, this would have a demand side effect as well as a supply side effect, because government expenditure will be increasing. But primarily what you're trying to do on supply side policies to reduce unemployment is to reduce the imperfections in the labour market, so that the three types of unemployment associated with the supply side of the labour market, with rigidities in the labour market, of course, are frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and classical or real wage unemployment. How do you solve these? Well, education and training. Say steel workers become unemployed, you may be able to retrain with IT skills so that they become more attractive to employees, and thereby you reduce structural unemployment. The problem with this, of course, is it depends on the quality of education, the quality of training, the willingness of workers to partake in this, and of course there's quite a significant time lag here, because you've got to undertake training and then get the appropriate job, and of course there could be a disparity in terms of location still, and it will come to that. So education and training depends on quality, quantity, and the other aspect, of course, is it involves more government spending. It usually does, okay, which might pose fiscal problems. Secondly, you could reduce the power of trade unions or reduce the national minimum wage, and this is likely to reduce the level of real wage unemployment. Trade unions tend to be a countervailing force to owners of firms, and they bargain for higher wages and better conditions. So trade unions could be a cause of real wage unemployment. Similarly, a national minimum wage that's too high could be a cause of real wage unemployment. But of course, if you reduce trade union power, you reduce the going wage level, and the same if you reduce the national minimum wage. And this could, of course, could result in relative poverty and certainly inequality, okay, which is the price to be paid. A third factor could be increasing labour market flexibility. So this is where you make it easier to hire and fire. So this could boost employment because employers will be worth the employer's risk to take on someone. It will be low cost. At the moment, many employees have to pay national insurance contributions, and this is obviously a tax on employment. If you reduce the employer's national insurance contribution, that may make it cheaper and reduce the costs of employment. Again, if you reduce the bureaucracy and red tape in terms of hiring and firing workers, and you made employment more insecure, then employers would feel more confident about taking on labour, and then if there was a downturn they could get rid of the labour. But of course the corollary of this is you've created job insecurity by doing this. So there's a price to be paid again. And then the stricter benefit requirements certainly have occurred in the US and the United Kingdom. Universal credit might be an example, which is a system to try and get people into work through work coaches, and trying to make work pay. But this might reduce the claimant count, but not necessarily a survey measure of unemployment, first of all. And of course, another thing you might want to do as part of this is to increase the benefit replacement ratio, which is the difference between net pay in work and net pay out of work. And if there's a greater differential here between in work and what you get out of work, then it makes work more worthwhile, and you're reducing the effective tax rate of losing the benefit and gaining work. However, of course, again, if you increase the benefit replacement ratio, you necessarily increase relative poverty and you increase inequality in society. And then lastly, not least, we've got geographical mobility, and this should actually help reduce structural unemployment. So if you have regional policy where firms move to areas of relative deprivation relatively slow growth and with pockets of high unemployment, then a good example might be Nissan locating in the northeast of England, an area of relatively high unemployment. This might create local jobs and of course a positive multiplier effect locally. However, much regional policy has arguably failed in a country like the United Kingdom, where London is very much dominant in terms of productivity and gross national product per head. Another aspect of this, of course, could be improving transport. So HS2, of course, a controversial issue, high-speed rail to link London to Birmingham to Manchester, other areas in the north. But it's debatable whether that would actually help development in the north, or would that development come down to London, again emphasise the London-centric nature of development. However, if you could improve regional transport links, such as local bus services, people are able to go from relatively poor towns to get jobs in relatively well-off cities, such as Manchester or Newcastle or Leeds. And if they can commute in, then they can get a job. If they don't have a car, they depend on public transport. Of course, parking charges can be quite prohibitive in city centres. So improved public transport at a regional level could be part of the solution to geographical mobility. But of course, if you can putting a new railway in, there's a time lag, and of course it often involves an increase in government spending. Okay, so here we are. Supply side policies, remember, are to deal with structural, frictional and real wage, classical unemployment, and demand side policies are very much to deal with demand deficient unemployment. Okay, thank you for watching.